You're listening to the multi-award-winning podcast from Rutgers Law School, The Power of Attorney. I'm your host and Dean of the Law School, Joanna Bond. On today's episode, I'm joined by Judge Stephen M. Orlofsky. Judge Orlovsky is a lawyer, a former judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey, and a former nominee to be a United States Circuit Court judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Prior to attending law school, Judge Orlovsky served in the Army during Vietnam, after which he came here to Rutgers. He graduated in 1974 from the Camden campus of Rutgers Law School and is a proud and active alum. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Judge Stephen Orlofsky. Welcome again, Judge. We're going to begin with a question that we ask many of our guests. Will you please share with us your origin story?
Good morning, Dean Bond. It's a pleasure
Good morning.
to see you again and speak with you. I was born on June 24th, 1944 in the South Bronx in a hospital called Bronx Hospital, which no longer exists. According to my mother, it was the hottest day ever. That was before climate change reached us. And when I was born, I was premature and I had some breathing problems. And in those days, doctors didn't have available to them all the technology and science that they have now to treat premature babies. So for a while, it was touch and go. And finally, the doctor said, he's going to be okay. This guy is a tough kid. And my mother said, and my mother said when she heard that, I didn't realize how tough it was going to be. In any event, I grew up in the South Bronx, went to public and elementary schools, I first became interested in the law in the 5th or 6th grade, believe it or not. There was some smattering of the Federalist Papers, and I was very intrigued by them. And I came home that day. I was 11, 12 years old. And I said to my mother, I said, Mom, I think I want to become a lawyer. And she said, oh, Stephen, you're not smart enough to be a lawyer. So in any event, okay, Mom.
I think you've proven her wrong.
Well, in any event, ultimately, I went to Stuyvesant High School, which was one of the 3 special schools in New York City for which you had to take a test. And I think at Stuyvesant High School, although I went on to college and law school, I think at Stuyvesant High School, I had in my class some of the brightest people in the world. When we were juniors, I guess, 15 or 16, we took the SAT tests. And my homeroom class, I think, had 16 boys in it. Stuyvesant was not co-ed at that time. It was all boys. It became co-ed in the 1980s. And 9 of them got perfect scores, 1,600, and I got a 1,575. And I told
That's pretty darn close.
And my mother said, "What are you, the dummy of the class? What did you get wrong?"
It sounds like she was kind of tough on you.
Yeah, well, she was. So in any event, I said, "Mom, they don't tell you what you're getting wrong." But it turned out, of the 9 who got perfect scores, 1 ultimately won the Nobel Prize in physics. And
Wow.
1 ultimately won the Nobel Prize in chemistry.
Amazing.
I went on from Stuyvesant High School by the way, Stuyvesant High School's graduation was traditionally held in Carnegie Hall. And our teacher, one of our teachers says, I want you to remember what I'm about to tell you. And what's that? He says, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And of course, we had no idea what he was talking about. He said, practice.
Words to live by.
Yeah.
That's great, Judge.
In any event, I went on to City College of New York, which at the time was pretty tough to get into. It was still tuition free, and it was, in those days, it was not open admissions, and it was pretty competitive to get in. I got in, majored in political science. Ultimately, when I graduated, I was thinking about law school, but I hadn't been admitted to law school. And so my student deferment expired in the end of 1965, 1966. And accordingly, I got drafted. What was happening is President Johnson had made a decision to send 30,000 men a month to Vietnam, but hadn't bothered to tell any of us. And so ultimately, I entered the Army in January 1966, went to basic training and advanced individual training in at Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas, quite a place. Um, and I, when I was assigned in advanced individual training to an artillery battery, and they were training me in what was called the Fire Direction Center. In the field artillery, there are three elements. There's a person called a forward observer who's out there with the infantry, calling in targets to the Fire Direction Center, who then plot the targets on maps and call the commands down to the guns. And the battery commander of that AIT battery was a young captain by the name of Jimmy D. Mount. I'll never forget him. He was a West Point graduate. He was just back from Vietnam, and he came in to see me one day, and he said, "Congratulations, Orlovsky, you're going to OCS." I said, "I am?" I said, "Captain, I don't remember applying for that." He said, "I applied for you." I said, "I guess I'm going to OCS."
That's great. And for the listeners who may not be familiar, will you tell everyone what OCS is?
OCS is Officer Candidate School. So I attended the United States Army Artillery and Missile School, Officer Candidate School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is in Lawton, Oklahoma. This was a 6-month program, and it was pretty demanding, both physically and intellectually. You have to understand that before I went into the Army, I had never fired a rifle or a pistol, not to mention a howitzer. I didn't know what a howitzer was. And they were training us essentially to learn how to fire howitzers, to provide artillery fire. So it was a pretty demanding program, both physically and intellectually. I graduated in December 17th, 1966. Our class was commissioned, and my best friend and OCS classmate, a guy by the name of Pinky Durham. That's right, his name was Pinky. He got that name when he was born at the hospital. They didn't have any blue blankets, so they gave him a pink blanket, and so he became Pinky. And I never knew his real name.
It was just Pinky.
It was just Pinky Durham, a real character. He grew up in Tifton, Georgia. He had never been further north than Tifton, Georgia, and I'd never been further south than the South Bronx, and we became brothers. Then, the war ensued. Unfortunately, Pinky was killed in Vietnam on October 17th, 1967, 10 months to the day after we graduated. And he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously. In those days, we didn't have texts or emails. And so I never found out that he had been killed until probably 1969. And I was just devastated. I don't know if I've shared this with you, but Pinky Durham's photograph and the citation which accompanied his Medal of Honor hangs on the wall of my office. And whenever I think I'm having a bad day, I go read the citation. And I recommend to you and anyone else that you Google Pinky's name and read the citation that accompanied his Medal of Honor. In any event, I got out of the Army in March of 1970, and I started thinking about law school, looking at law schools, and I applied to a couple, and I discovered a law school I hadn't really heard of before called Rutgers Law School.
Excellent.
I was familiar with Rutgers University, but I didn't know it had a law school, and it was somewhere in a place called Camden, New Jersey, a place I had never been before. Dean Bond, you probably had that experience yourself.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So
And
tell us a little bit more about why you ultimately chose Rutgers.
well, it was interesting. I applied to a couple of others, Columbia, Yale, and while I got in, the prices were astronomical. They were really, even with financial aid. And I was thinking, really, and I was just getting out of the army. I really didn't have any assets or any. And so I went down to visit the law school. This was just before they moved into the new what was then the new building, now the old building. Um, the law school had been functioning out of some essentially a warehouse, a Campbell soup warehouse somewhere in the city of Camden. And I went down and I visited, and I looked at the city of Camden, and I was, wow, you know, it was quite a shocker. And I had, I asked to talk to, an interview with, just to talk to somebody about it. And I interviewed with a Professor Don Kepner. Don Kepner was quite a character. I ultimately had him for civil procedure um, and federal courts. And he was a real character. And so I met him, and he told me, he says, look, next year we're moving into a brand new building. This is not where you're going to go to law school. And he talked to me about the law school. He said, look, this law school is starting to grow. It's going to be great someday. This will be a great opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing that was very attractive is that the tuition was much more reasonable than any place else. And, I said, why not? So ultimately, I accepted Rutgers, and I began at Rutgers in September 1971. Now, my first day of law school is probably different than the first day of law school of most law students. Um, it was September 1971. The first day of law school, I wore my Army field jacket, and a bunch of us, I guess, first year law students, were milling about on the outside what was then the new law school building, and some guy I'd never seen before in my life came up to me, looked at my field jacket, and said, "Oh, you're one of those baby killers." Well, um, that did not resonate with me, so to speak. And I was still in pretty good shape in those days, and I'd even boxed in college. And then I hit him with a right cross. He went down like a stone. And I said, I don't kill babies, but I do kill assholes.
I love that story. I've heard you tell it before, Judge, and I love it every single time. So you have to tell us what happened after that.
Well, two significant things happened after that. First, as I'm walking away from hitting this guy, I'm thinking to myself, this is probably not the best way to start law school.
Fair. That's fair enough.
About 3 days later, I was in, I think, my con law class. I was wearing my Army field jacket, and a very attractive young blonde woman came up to me, looked at my field jacket, and she said, "Oh, welcome home. Thank you for your service. My name is Charlotte Cole." Charlotte and I were married 3 years later.
That's such a great story.
Charlotte was the first one to welcome me home. But I wasn't done with my first day at law school. In those days, we didn't have text or email, so people would leave messages on the bulletin board, and everybody would check the bulletin board every day to see, if there were any messages. So one day I checked the bulletin board, and sure enough, there's a message that says, "Mr. Orlovsky, Dean Fairbanks would like to see you in his office tomorrow." I said, Dean Fairbanks was the dean of the law school.
Right.
And I'm thinking, well, I'm going to get thrown out of law school. So the next day, I go up to Dean Fairbanks's office. I'm still wearing my Army field jacket. He's sitting behind his desk in a three-piece suit, And sitting there on a couch in his office is the guy I hit. Dean Fairbanks looks at me and he says, Captain Orlovsky, your colleague over there tells me you assaulted him. I said, yes, sir, I did. And if he calls me baby killer again, I'm going to assault him again. Dean Fairbanks smiled, looked at me, looked at the guy on the couch. He said, you're excused. Please leave and close the door.
Not to you, but to the other guy. Right. Yes. Okay.
And he says to me, Orlovsky, you probably don't know this, but I commanded an infantry company of the 82nd Airborne in World War II. I'm still in the reserves, and I'm a two-star general. He said, and I called the Department of the Army about you. And you have a distinguished military record. And if you would come home in my war, people would be shaking your hand and buy you drinks. And he said, look, if anybody bothers you again, please don't hit them. Come see me. I'll take care of it. And I look at him, okay. I said, but what about him? Pointing to the door and the guy who had just left. He looked at me, he winked, and he said, who? And that was the end of it.
That was it.
Now, Dean Bond, I'm not going to ask you what you would have done if you were the dean when I came into your office, because I have a feeling the result might have been a little different. But we don't have to go into what you would have done.
Fair. That's fair enough. But I'm thrilled that Dean Fairbanks handled it the way that he did, and that we can now claim you as one of our most esteemed graduates. So we're thrilled that you stayed. And
it turned out, it was still, I guess, in those days, the early 70s, at Rutgers Law School. Obviously, it hadn't been combined with Rutgers Law School in Newark, but it was still a growing law school, and the legal education was great. The faculty was great. I had some great teachers, and there were some subjects that really interested me: con law, criminal law, federal jurisdiction, and those sorts of things. And it really opened my eyes to the world of law. I really didn't know anything. No one in my family had ever been a lawyer. I'd never worked at a law firm. I didn't know what lawyers did. And, I was impressed by the tremendous diversity of activities that lawyers engaged in. And another great thing happened. My third year, at that time, the law school had an internship program, and I had applied for an internship to clerk for the then Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey, Chief Judge Mitchell Cohen, to be an intern. And in those days, internship programs were just starting out, and there were internship programs with judges, and legal services, and all sorts of public agencies. And you had to interview for this, and I interviewed, and one of my classmates I was a class of 74, he was a class of 73. Joel Rosen, who became my best friend and ultimately my magistrate judge, was then clerking for Judge Cohen. And if you would ask Joel what happened, he would tell you, yeah, Steve came in, he interviewed with the judge. Steve blew the interview, but I told the judge that he should overlook that and you should take him on as an intern.
So he takes credit.
He takes credit for everything.
Right. Okay.
The day I was sworn in as a federal judge, he took credit for that too.
It's nice to have good friends like that.
So anyway, interning for Judge Cohen was, just think about it. I'm a young law student. I'm not even out of law school. I'm clerking for a federal judge, not just a federal judge, but the chief judge of a district. And Judge Cohen was an incredible guy. He was a great judge. He had been a trial lawyer. He had been a county prosecutor. And he was just a wonderful guy, a sort of a Renaissance man. Somehow he had a grade school friend who was producing a show called My Fair Lady. And Judge Cohen invested in it, and suddenly became very wealthy. So,
That's a wise investment, I would say.
and
Well,
I said, Judge, how did you know to do this? She said, Steve, you just have to know the right people. And I met Herb Levin, who was the producer, in the fourth grade, and I figured I could trust him.
that's fantastic.
So, so after as I was clerking, I applied for a job at the United States Attorney's Office in Newark, and Jonathan Goldstein was the U.S. Attorney, and he offered me a job as an AUSA to begin when I finished my clerkship. And this was and in those days, this was a great opportunity, especially if he wanted to become a, a trial lawyer. And the United States Attorney's Office with the District of New Jersey had a long and storied history. I won't go into its history today, but it was much different back then. And then, so I was finishing my clerkship, and one day, Judge Cohn came into the law library and said, Steve, you're not going to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I said, I'm not. He says, no, I have another job for you. I said, what's that, Judge? He says, you're going to be the first magistrate judge in Camden. I said, Judge, I haven't practiced law at all. He said, Steve, it's okay. You're smarter than anybody else we're going to find. You've watched me. You know what to do.
Right.
And you have, with your military experience, you'll have no trouble doing this. And in those days, magistrates were selected by majority vote of the district judges.
Okay.
And I said, well, what would the judges say? And I'll never forget what Judge Cohn said to me. And in this deep, deep voice of his, he said, quote, my dear boy, I have the votes, close quote.
That's great. I'm sure he obviously did. He knew what he was talking about, and he recognized talent.
So today, after a couple of years, the Magistrates Act was amended, and now you have to be admitted at least 10 years. The court has to advertise. There's a committee that interviews applicants, and it's a much different process. So it could never happen like that today. So I went from law clerk to magistrate judge.
And then eventually into private practice at Blank Rome,
So I
correct?
got into private practice. I had 3 children at the time, and Joel, who claims he got me jobs everywhere, was then an associate at Blank Rome, Comiskey, and Macaulay in Philadelphia. And I was talking to him one day, and I said, Joel, I've got 3 kids. I've got to find a real job. And Joel said, Ed Rome, who was one of the founding partners of Blank Rome, had appeared before me, believe it or not, on a motion. And that was an incredible experience for me. I mean, it was like, who is this guy? I mean, really.
He was such a talented lawyer that he left that
Ed Rome
impression.
was probably one of the 25 best lawyers in the history of the Republic. That's how good
Wow.
he was. So he said, Steve, why don't you call Ed Rome? He was very impressed with you, and I won't tell him what an asshole you are.
That's good.
So and naturally, I interviewed with Ed Rome. He ultimately hired me, and I joined Blank Rome in its Philadelphia office. We didn't have a New Jersey office then, in 1980, in something called we had practice groups were about 10 or 15 years away for law firms, but Ed had formed his own practice group. He called it Complex Litigation, and it consisted mostly of securities and antitrust cases, a lot of class actions. So I essentially became his lawyer, and he would always say to me, Stephen, don't tell me what I can't do. Tell me what I can do. And, and that became ingrained in me. Ultimately, in 1984, Blank Rome opened its own office under its own name in New Jersey. Prior to that, under the New Jersey rules of professional conduct, every lawyer whose name was in a law firm name had to be admitted in New Jersey. And Ed Rome and Marvin Comiskey were not interested in taking the New Jersey bar exam. But now Blank Rome could practice under that name provided they designated a New Jersey responsible lawyer, and they picked me to be the New Jersey responsible lawyer. So I came over to New Jersey with Blank Rome and opened its office first office in New Jersey in 1984, and practiced in. It was pretty active trial practice. It was both civil and criminal, um, and I was a pretty active practitioner. And one day I guess in 1995, Bill Clinton had been elected president in 1992, and a vacancy occurred in the district court. And one day I got a call from Senator Frank Lautenberg, whom I didn't know. And he said, "I heard a lot about you. How'd you like to be a federal judge?" I said, "I'd like that very much, Senator." So he interviewed me, and it was pretty competitive.
That's probably an understatement, Judge.
And what made it difficult was most people don't realize this, but people who have been either active politically or have made significant political donations usually get serious consideration. I hadn't been active politically, and I certainly had not made any significant political donations. But what happened is I had, when I had been a magistrate judge, I worked for the then Chief Judge John F. Gary. Judge Gary was a Princeton graduate, and he went to the Harvard Law School. He was really bright, really funny, and he was into baseball. And he had a tryout with the New York Giants as a left-handed pitcher. It didn't go well, and in fact, as he was pitching, all the hitters hit line drives off the wall at the Polo Grounds, and he got the name Boom Boom Gary thereafter. So he was known as Boom Boom Gary.
Oh no!
So,
did you bond over baseball?
I'm sorry?
Did you bond over baseball?
And I was his magistrate judge, and we got to work together, and we were very close. And so Senator Lautenberg was doing his due diligence, and he called Judge Gary about me, and Judge Gary must have been very persuasive. In any event, Judge Gary became ill, unfortunately, and was dying of cancer. And his wife, Jean, called me one day in the office, and she said, "Steve, come out to the house. Jack wants to see you." So I'll go out to Judge Gary's house in Morristown, and she says, "Steve, he's upstairs in the bedroom. Go up and see him. It's okay." So I go up to see him, and he's literally on his deathbed, and he looks at me, and he says, "Steve, I had a call today from Senator Lautenberg about you. I'm sorry, but I had to tell him the truth."
Okay.
So then he says, "Do you think you can fill my shoe?"
And what did you say?
I was speechless. First of all, he's dying and he's doing shtick.
Right.
I said, "Judge, I said, nobody can ever fill your shoe, but I'll do my best." And then he said a classic line that has followed me from that day to this. He said, "Steve, the thing about being a judge is you have to be yourself unless you're a jackass. Steve, you're going to have to be somebody else."
All right. I don't want our listeners to believe that any of that is true. You are a wonderful, wonderful person.
So another incredible coincidences. In the 1980s, I had a partner in Philadelphia by the name of Neil Steinman, who came into my office one day, and this is mid-1980s, and "Steve, I need you to write a check for $1,000 to Bill Clinton for governor of Arkansas." And I said, "Neil, we are sitting in Philadelphia. Why am I writing a check?" to somebody who's running for governor of Arkansas. And Neil says to me, Bill Clinton was in my law school class at, at Yale, and he's going to be president of the United States someday, and he's going to nominate you to the federal bench. I said, yeah, right, Neil. Sure enough, the president calls you when they nominate you.
Mm-hmm.
And so President Clinton got on the phone with me, and I'd never met him. And he was a very chatty guy. And he says, Steve, I want to nominate you to the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey. He said, Neil Steinman wants me to nominate you to the Court of Appeals, but I think we should take this one step at a time.
He was giving you a tryout.
I said, I agree, Mr. President. He said, good. I will submit your nomination to the Senate. So I went through the nomination process. Now, we'd all read in the Constitution how presidents nominate federal judges with the advice of consent of the Senate. But it is quite a process. The United States Senate consists of 100 separate kingdoms.
Right.
So anyway, I was nominated. I was confirmed 100-0 when I told my dear wife, Charlotte Gall of blessed memory, that I was confirmed 100-0. She said, well, they don't know you as well as I do.
I'm glad you had people in your life, Judge, to keep you humble. Charlotte did that, it sounds like.
Charlotte would tell everybody it was her job to keep me humble. And unfortunately, she did too good a job of it.
Yes, I believe that. And so how long were you on the bench then?
Okay, so I went on the bench I sworn in on February 5th, 1996, and I left August 1, 2003. Let me tell you a little bit about my experience as a district judge. I had some interesting cases. One of the first cases I had, which, and you have a lot of cases. I mean, the docket, we were short judges in those days, and the docket was amazing. And so there was a heavy criminal load. And one of the first criminal cases, involved a guy by the name of Michael Norwood, who was charged with bank robbery and carjacking. Carjacking was then a new statute. It had just been enacted by Congress as a result of essentially carjackings throughout the country, and there was no federal statute that criminalized that conduct. So the Norwood case is assigned to me, and it involves the carjacking statute, which had never been tried by any judge before in the District of New Jersey. And he was represented by the Federal Public Defender's Office. He was African American, and his lawyer wanted to present expert testimony. A lot of the testimony involved identification of Norwood as the bank robber. She wanted to present expert testimony on the issue of cross-racial identification. That is, the discrepancies in witness identification of Caucasians identifying African Americans.
Right.
And that had never been done before. Obviously, it involved an application of the Daubert principles. And so I wrote an opinion granting her motion to allow expert testimony on the issue of cross-racial identification.
Wow, that's fantastic. That must have established important precedent in New Jersey.
And ultimately, a couple of years later, I was asked to sit by designation on the Third Circuit with Chief Judge Becker and Judge Roth. And we had a carjacking case. And since I had experience, Judge Becker said, well, Jane and I don't know anything about this carjacking statute. You do, you write the opinion. So I got to write an opinion in the Third Circuit on carjacking.
Fantastic.
One of the other cases that was interesting that I'll mention briefly was a case involving the construction of a cement plant in the city of Camden. And a group of South Jersey residents, known as the South Camden Citizens in Action, brought an action against the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection based on violation of the EPA's Title VI environmental justice regulations. And after much argument and briefing, I wrote about a 150-page opinion um, granting the injunction sought to prevent the opening of the cement plant, implying a cause of action on the EPA's Title VI regulations. About 2 weeks after I filed that opinion, the United States Supreme Court, Justice Scalia, in a 5-4 decision in a case called Alexander v. Sandoval, overruled 30 years of civil rights jurisprudence and said you could no longer bring implied cause of actions based on federal regulations.
Wow.
However, there was a dissent by Justice Stevens in that case, where Justice Stevens said, well, it doesn't matter really because this claim can be brought under the Civil Rights Statute, 28 U.S.C. Section 1983. So I bring the lawyers back in. I obviously have to vacate the injunction, and I ask them to brief the question of whether the South Jersey Citizens in Action can amend their complaint to assert this claim under 1983. So another round of briefing. And ultimately, I write a second opinion, finding that the claim can be asserted under the Civil Rights Action, under the Civil
Excellent.
Rights Statute 42.
Because Justice Stevens had opened the door for that.
Right. So naturally, the case goes up to the Third Circuit, and I'm ultimately reversed 2-1. It was a dissent, one dissent, and the majority opinion was written by Judge Morton Greenberg. So I called him. I said, Morty, you've got this all wrong. Did you read the record?
I love it. And had he?
And he said, of course. Steve, you were exercising executive power, not judicial power, blah, blah, blah. He said, you're a great judge, but you got this one wrong. A couple of years later, Judge Greenberg takes senior status. Judge Greenberg takes senior status, which creates a vacancy on the Third Circuit. And President Clinton nominates me to fill the vacancy. So I call Morty. I said, the president has nominated me to fill your seat, Morty. He says, congratulations. I said, yeah, the president called me. He said, we're trading up.
That's great. That's great. Did he appreciate that? Did he have a sense of humor?
He did.
Oh, good.
He did. Unfortunately, it was too close to the 2000 presidential election. And so I never got a hearing, and the nomination died in committee. But
that is clearly our loss.
But at the time, Judge Rosen, of course, captured the essence of the episode in one sentence and circulated an email to the court and said, if Orlovsky is elevated to the Third Circuit, it will raise the average IQ of both courts.
I love it. I love it. That's fantastic.
So ultimately, I decided, and had I stayed, I probably would have been nominated again to the Third Circuit. But my docket had become overwhelmed by drug cases. I mean, possession and distribution of CDS, and felon in possession of a firearm.
Right.
And I just decided that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life doing that. And so I went back to Blank Rome. Now, my partners at Blank Rome will tell you that they took me back into the partnership by an equally divided vote. And so I went back to Blank Rome, went back to its New Jersey office, which was then in Cherry Hill, and resumed the practice, and also developed an alternative dispute resolution practice involving arbitrations and mediations. And I'm now working on developing an appellate practice with Judge Lewis, who was a judge on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and so we are actively building an appellate practice. We have a
That's
practice group. Although we'd all done a lot of appeals, we never formalized it into a practice group, and now we have.
That's wonderful. I want to talk about the importance of appellate practice in a moment, but in the meantime, I want to ask you about your favorite part of the job. What do you enjoy most about the work that you're doing now?
Well, I've always loved trying cases, but unfortunately, we don't try too many cases anymore for
Right.
lots of reasons. It's too expensive. Many now, because of the availability of alternative dispute resolutions, a lot of cases get tried in arbitration or get settled in mediation. But trying a case was always a fun part of the job. It was always an experience that I loved. But I also enjoy arguing appeals, both in state and federal court, and in doing mediations. Trying to settle. Usually the cases I mediate involve issues where there's a lot at stake.
Right.
And the same is true with arbitrations. And the thing about arbitrations is people who decide to go to arbitration can do what is essentially legal judge shopping. They can pick, the arbitrator. Now, the disadvantages are that discovery is limited in arbitrations, and there's essentially no appeal.
Right.
But it's convenient, it's faster, it's cheaper, and clients who want a quick decision are willing to give up limited discovery, or give up discovery and give up the right to appeal for a quick resolution.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can understand it must be gratifying to bring those cases to resolution as a mediator arbitrator. One of the things that I want to ask you about has to do with a trip that you took to Iraq back in 2003 with two other federal judges on a mission to help Iraqis who supported the U.S. during the Second Gulf War. And I want to ask you about the details of that trip, because in my mind, it just demonstrates your humanity in so many ways. But so
Well, let me tell you how that came about.
yeah, let's delve into that.
Obviously, the Second Gulf War was ongoing, and I guess in March or April of 2003, I got a call from Chief Judge Becker of the Third Circuit, who was a friend of mine, who said, "Steve, we want to send been talking to the highest levels of our government," which to me meant he was talking to Senator Arlen Specter, who was a law school classmate of his at Yale. And I said, "Really, what did Arlen have to say?" And he said, "We want to send a delegation of judges to Iraq to examine the courts and make recommendations to get the courts up and running after the war. And we'd like to send you'd be perfect with your military background." And I said, "Ed, are they sending any Republicans?" I'll get back to you. So I go home and I tell Charlotte about it. She knew Ed Rum. I said, "Ed Rum called me today." She said, "What did he want?" So I told her. She says, "You're not going. Don't be ridiculous." I said, "Look, we have 150,000 troops. This is for them. It's going to be a lot harder to make peace than to make war." So over her objection, I went. And there were two other federal judges who were part of the group, plus a bunch of federal public defenders, and AUSAs. And the goal was, although it wasn't clear at the time, was to visit the courts, inspect the courts, and then make recommendations to, you know, then it was called the Coalition Governing Authority, about how to reorganize the Iraqi courts. Now, the Iraqi courts at the time were civil courts modeled after the French and Egyptian models. They didn't have jury trials. They didn't have common law. It was statutory. It was basically statutory law. And in Iraq, it had what is called Sharia law, which is religious law, which governs the relationships between men and women and marriage, and the grounds for divorce, which was completely different than our law. Essentially, women in Iraq had no rights. But anyway, so we when we got there, we organized into three separate groups. One group to visit the courthouses in northern Iraq, one in central Iraq, and another in southern Iraq. Now, I needed an interpreter, and I had a young Iraqi female attorney, I guess she was between 25 and 30, to serve as my interpreter. Now, she would have to travel with us, so she had to get permission from her father to travel with us without an escort. Judge Rosen said her father will never agree when he finds out about your reputation. But in any event, she did. And she traveled with us. And they were, many of the Iraqis had not gotten President Bush's message about mission accomplished. And so there was a lot of what I'll call insurgent action. There were snipers and all kinds of things. And so she traveled with us to visit various courthouses, both as an interpreter and also to provide some insight into the Iraqi judicial system, which was essentially under Saddam completely corrupt. It was, so ultimately it became so dangerous that they decided to pull us out. We originally were supposed to be there for about 3 months, but by July 4th it had become pretty dangerous, and they decided to withdraw us. When I got home around July 4, 2003, I got an email from Fountain, who had been my interpreter, that because she and her brothers had cooperated with us, someone came looking for them. They were not home, so they murdered her father.
Oh, it's awful. Terrifying.
So I said, Fountain, don't worry. In September, I will be practicing law again, and we will find a way to get you out. So I went back into private practice at Blank Rome in September of 2003, and among other things, I became an immigration lawyer. My experience with the INS as a district judge had not been a happy one. The INS generally knew one word, no, to everything.
Mm-hmm.
But in any event, so my partners and I began this effort to get them out. And it took us 6 years. We got Fountain, her 2 brothers, her mother, and 2 sisters out. And they're all American citizens. Now, Fountain came to the United States. We got her a job as a paralegal in Blank Rome's Philadelphia office. And her brother Bassam, who had a master's degree in computer science, we got him a job in our Philadelphia office as in IT, in our IT department. Bassam was very interested in the law, so he applied to Rutgers Law School, to the night school. He got in, he was admitted, and when he graduated, Dean Solomon, one of your predecessors, called me and said, Bassam is graduating. I want you to come to the graduation and present him with his diploma.
Wow.
I want everybody to hear this story. So
That is so inspiring, Judge. And again, I think it reflects so much about you and your sense of humanity and your commitment to public service. But uh, I I just love that story, and hearing about the lengths that you went to try and get this family out and to safety is really an inspiration. Um, so I want to ask a little bit about the memorial scholarship that you established in honor of your late wife. It's the Charlotte K. Gall Endowed Memorial Scholarship. And it is, as I mentioned, in honor of your wife, your late wife of 46 years, whom you mentioned you met at law school, at Rutgers Law School. Can you tell us what the scholarship means to you and why you established it in Charlotte's name?
when Charlotte went to Rutgers, she was receiving financial assistance, and she was the class of '74 was a class that had the largest population of female law students. I think 45% of my class was female, which was very unusual at the time.
Remarkable for that time.
And um, so she had financial assistance, and obviously, she went through. I think I've told you, as a young lawyer, she broke through a lot of glass ceilings, had to deal with a lot of female anti-female discrimination, uh, not just from lawyers, but from the bench, particularly from the bench. In fact, she became the first female assistant county prosecutor in Camden County, and the bench was all white, all male, and very unhospitable. I mean,
I can
she was
imagine.
called honey, sweetie, girly prosecutrix,
Wow.
and it was tough. I'm sure you can appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely.
And I decided, she had been the beneficiary of financial assistance when she went to law school, and I thought that a fitting tribute would be to establish a scholarship, establish a scholarship in her name to provide financial assistance to female law students at Rutgers Camden, and that's really the basis and the reason for it.
It's remarkable, and I'm so glad that you chose to honor her in that way. I want to talk about another recent gift that you've given to the law school, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your willingness to give back to Rutgers. But recently, you established the Stephen M. Orlofsky Endowed Appellate Advocacy Fund at Rutgers Law. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to start that fund?
Two things. It was first to give back to Rutgers what it gave to me, a life in the law. Those of us who were returning as veterans were not welcomed home. There were no parades. Dean Fairbanks, well, welcomed me back in his own way.
Right, right.
I got a great legal education that gave me the opportunity to go on to become a federal judge and practice law at a major national law firm at a high level. And none of that would have happened but for Rutgers. That's the first reason. The second reason is, given the situation in which our country finds us, it's more important than ever to defend and protect the Constitution and the rule of law than ever. And more than ever, that happens in appellate courts. Trial courts are very important, and Rutgers and many law schools have very active trial advocacy programs, and they should continue to do that. But it's becoming more important to those of us in the practice how important appellate advocacy is. Many clients now insist in important trials to have appellate lawyers involved in the trial process to make sure that issues are preserved for appeal, and that if they can't win in the trial court, that they have an opportunity to prevail in the appellate court. And the other thing is, you know, our country is approaching its 250th anniversary. And for years and years, the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, as the third branch of our government, has been viewed as the jewel in the crown of our democracy. That has been called into question recently. Now, over the years, the Supreme Court has handed down some brilliant decisions and some horrible decisions. We can begin with Marbury versus Madison. We can talk about Dred Scott. We can talk about Plessy v. Ferguson. We can talk about Brown versus Board of Education, Gideon v. Wainwright, the Miranda case. You've read the cases that have come down from the Supreme Court. We now have a new concept to deal with called the shadow docket, which is another challenge for appellate advocates. So it's more important than ever to train our lawyers about appellate advocacy and get lawyers to specialize in appellate advocacy, just as they specialize in trial practice or patent law or whatever law interests them. And I just think that the time is right and it's important, and Rutgers has the tools to do it. And I have complete confidence in you, Dean Bond, that you will manage this program and make a success out of it.
Well, thank you so much, Judge, for saying that and for your confidence in me. I am thrilled that we're going to be able to build upon our existing appellate advocacy program and expand and improve the skills training that we're offering to students, because, as you said, this is one of the most essential skills for lawyers, and we want to be training them to have a huge impact on the law in all the ways that you and I have talked about. It matters more now than ever. So I'm thrilled, and I so appreciate your generosity towards Rutgers Law. I want to end by asking you what advice you would give to students who aspire to pursue a career in law. What advice would you give?
At bottom, I became a lawyer because I wanted to make a difference in the lives of people. And I have, both as a judge and as a lawyer, and even as a former military officer. And the law gives you a vehicle and an opportunity to do that. It doesn't matter what your political affiliation is or what your view of certain issues is. If you become a lawyer, we'll give you the skills to advocate and promote whatever policy is important, to support whatever group, whether it be political, racial, ethnic, religious, is important to you. Because what differentiates us, our country, from the rest of the world is the rule of law. And that is why I urge people to consider law as a profession.
Wow, well said, Judge. You and I are kindred spirits in that way. That is exactly what drew me to law school as well. This notion that law was a way to have a positive impact on the world. So thank you so much for those comments. And thank you again for appearing with us today and for sharing your wisdom and for sharing the details about your incredibly distinguished career. As I said before, we are so lucky to call you one of our alumni, and I really appreciate everything that you have done and continue to do for Rutgers Law School. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Take care, Judge. The Power of Attorney is a production of Rutgers Law School. With 2 locations just minutes from New York City and Philadelphia, Rutgers Law offers the prestige and reputation of a large, nationally known university with a personal, small campus experience. Learn more by visiting us at law.rutgers.edu.